Alright, today we are going to be rebuilding an A-523 transmission out of a 92 Dodge Shadow. This has got that numerically lower 372 final drive, and we got it cleaned up with this gunk engine degreaser. I'm only showing this because it's legitimately the best stuff I've ever used. This was a dirty, nasty trans with a couple 100,000 miles on it, and this stuff really cut through the gunk before I put it in the parts washer. So nonetheless, let's go ahead and get started on this today. With the case relatively degreased, we took off the snout on the front of the trans there by first removing the speed distance sensor with a 10mm socket. Then we removed the actual snout itself by pulling the 13mm bolts out of there. There are 4 of them, and then probably giving it a little whack with a dead blow hammer, twisting it out. Easy enough. Next up, you need to remove all of the 15mm headed bolts that are holding the cover to the case. With the diff cover bolts removed, I next pull off the 6 13mm bearing support plate from the driver's side. Those 6 bolts come off pretty easily, although it's nice to use a swivel socket for one of them because you do get kind of close to the case. Nonetheless, when you pull that off, a little bit of pry bar action, and that diff will be ready to come out, so be careful because it can just roll on out of there. With the diff all out of the case, I then pull the selector cover off with the 6 10mm headed bolts coming out next. Be careful because those springs and roller detents in there can be easily lost, and if you lose them, good luck finding new ones. I don't like to take any chances with the springs and roller detents after I take off the cover, so I immediately take a magnet and pull those out of the case so that I can safely set them off to the side and avoid any children coming along to help in the process and thereby losing the springs. Up next, we can pull the end cover off of the case. That's a bunch of 10mm headed bolts, and once those are free, you might need to use a little bit of persuasion from a screwdriver to pry, or perhaps a dead blow hammer. It will come free fairly easily though. Don't get carried away and go punching holes through the end cover. It's just cast aluminum after all. With 5th gear exposed, it's fairly simple to remove that 5th gear synchro. You just need to use a punch to take out that roll pin and then remove the lock ring. I highly recommend having the appropriate size punches. Mine were in rough shape, so I ordered a new set of Starrett punches for about $45 off of Amazon. And then I've always had a great set of lock ring pliers that I got from Craftsman years ago before they outsourced everything to China, and those bad lads are still going strong. Once you have the roll pin and that lock ring out, it's time to pull off that 5th gear synchro. Be careful though, because there's a lot of bits into that, and you don't want to have either the shift fork or anything else fall apart there. Make sure you got a hold of everything and pull it all off in one shot. With that synchro removed, it's time to pull off the nut that is present on the 89 and later transmissions back there for 5th gear. Now for this, I do use Miller Tool 6252. However, an impact alone will do it here. Nonetheless, I use the tool and am very careful because I don't want to break anything. Also, this nut is one of those that you're technically supposed to replace. Not gonna lie, I never have, and I've never had any issues. I've never even looked to see if it's available though. So if anybody out there knows of that, let me know in the comments. This next step, we'll be polite and call it the Pragmatist Special here, but these are bits and pieces of a Harbor Freight bearing splitter that I've basically lost half of it over the years. And when combined with Miller Tool 6252 as something to push on, you can remove that 5th gear. I'm not going to lie, I've done it by prying with 2 screwdrivers before, and quite frankly, there are a lot of transmissions I've pulled apart where it will just come off by hand. So choose your own destiny. 4 10mm bolts need to come out of the back of the case, and in order to expose the rear bearing and also the shuttle interlocks there, once again, be careful with these bad lads. If you lose them, they're gone. There is a snap ring on the large bearing at the back of the intermediate shaft. Remove that and you should now be able to pull out that bearing support plate, if you will. I should caution you that a lot of this in this phase here that I've done with the intention of making it easier for you, the viewer, to follow along, and some of that worked out in my favor, some of it didn't. If I were to tell you how to do it on the bench without a camera present that you're trying to work around, I would definitely say to remove all the roll pins in the case from all the shift forks before you go ahead and pull the back case apart. It just keeps those shift rails in place a little bit better. Nonetheless, with the cover out of the way, you can now see the intermediate shaft and the input shaft there. If you scooch the input shaft up a little bit, you can weasel the reverse gear out of there. Make sure to have that spacer and silencer along with it, and please don't lose them. I have forgotten to put that blocker in there before, and you don't want to do that because then that reverse is going to slide all the way out of the way and you're going to have some real problems, so be on the lookout for that one. Alright, well, this is one area where the home shop and the home recording studio combined and not make the best video necessarily, but we're going to try our best here, guys. There is this C-clip on the 5th speed rail, or the 5th gear rail, I guess if you want to call it that. And when you pull out that C-clip, it should allow that rail to come out. Once that rail comes out, you have to be careful because that selector section on there between 5th and the reverse rail, there is a little interlock. It's just a little piece of metal, I guess a little almost rounded on the ends dowel. It almost looks like a detent. And that interlock is in there. You don't want to lose that because, again, good luck sourcing a new one. I would definitely just go ahead and pull out all of the roll pins. That's what I had to do eventually. I broke down and removed every single roll pin, and then you can put the rails back in place and drive the pins in easily enough through the opening in the selector housing cover, if you will. One thing that I think I didn't necessarily get shown in here is the fact that there is that selector that reaches over to the pivot for reverse, and I must have pulled that out and not shown it. But nonetheless, this is really kind of a rough deal here. If you guys really want, shoot me an email or something, and I will try and send you some scans out of the factory service manual. Okay, with all the rails free and ready to come out, you can now grab both the input shaft and the intermediate shaft simultaneously and pull them out. Again, I did this on the edge of the bench for the camera. I would definitely recommend either standing the case upright or setting it long ways on the bench because the shift forks will definitely want to slide right off of that intermediate shaft, and you don't want to damage either the shift forks or, heaven forbid, lose a shift fork pad because, again, those aren't growing on trees. Huge shout out to Adam Lingle from the Shelby Dodge Automobile Club who makes these things out of brass. You can order them from him. He makes them on occasion. Check out turbo-mopar.com for details. Alright, let's have a gander inside of this beautiful case. This trans actually ended up being in amazing condition. All I did was replace the bearings. Nothing else needed to be done. However, down here is this bearing retainer with some E-Torx bolts, which do use a little bit of Loctite when you put them back in. I, of course, put everything back together only to realize that that little bearing retainer was not in there, so I had to disassemble the entire trans. Ooh, that was not fun. I did not remove this bearing. I checked it out. It seemed okay, and quite frankly, this bearing is unavailable, or if you can find one, they're about $150. This whole trans looked so good, I decided to leave well enough alone. A good artist knows when to put down the brush. All right, here's everything you really get out of the case, essentially. You got your 5th gear with the synchro over here. You got your matching bit for the input shaft. There's that bearing plate piece, if you will, a couple lock rings, snap rings. This was that reverse selector that I just took off that sat in there. There's your reverse rail. There's your 5th gear rail. Under here, I believe, is your 1-2 selector rail. And then over here all the way on the right, you've got your 3-4 selector rail. So these are really quite a bit more involved than the what should I say, than the 555s. There's quite a bit more to them, which is fine. I mean, they shift smoother, there's no doubt about that. And I think at high RPM they shift a little bit better too. But nonetheless, it's going to be for the minivan, so we will very much enjoy this. This whole trans looks excellent. I will only pop off this bearing here. I got a new Mopar unit for it. I'll pop this bearing off, which just requires removal of the lock ring and a bearing splitter. Boop, right off. Put the new one back on, and we're going to be styling this. Trans looks phenomenal. This right here is going to be worth the cost of admission for the car that I parted out to get it. So, excellent, excellent, excellent. Also, one thing to note, I think even not that I'm some grand expert, but I've been around these transmissions a fair bit, and even I would definitely not be able to tell the difference between a 568 and this 570 or 377 final drive gear set, and these 523s, the later 523s. And it does, from what I understand, I think the fifth gear is a little bit lower, or excuse me, not lower, but the fifth gear is the same, but the numerically lower final drive, which is to say higher gear, will get you a little bit better gas mileage on the freeway. And in these days of $4 to $5 premium gas, sounds like a good bargain to me.
To remove the throwout bearing is a pretty simple process. Just remove the E-clip that holds that clutch lever, if you will, in place, and then that will scoot right out the side of the case, and you can you really have to pull the fork for the throwout bearing kind of at the same time, and then everything just slides off the front. It's pretty simple, really. With the throwout bearing out of the way, we can now remove that snout from inside the bell housing there. Behind it, you should find a shim. That's the shim that sets the preload on the input shaft. Now, before you get this process started, you're going to want to make sure that you've got a selection of those. I've found that this can vary pretty wildly, and quite honestly, I believe it's Raytech that makes a kit of 10,000ths shims, and I mean not 10,000ths of an inch, but 10 1,000ths of an inch shims, and then you can just stack them as deep as you need to. So nonetheless, all the shims for this trans, please have a plan ahead of time, because you're probably not like me with 8 transmissions in the basement to go picking and pulling shims from. And if you are, good for you, you're doing it the right way. Remove the lock ring from the large bearing at the back of the intermediate shaft. With that lock ring removed, sometimes you get lucky and you can pull it off by hand. Some guys I know, John Trotter, I'm looking at you, buddy, use 2 screwdrivers, and you know what? That works. And I would actually be a little less embarrassed to do that than use, once again, my cobbled together monstrosity. But as they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. This is definitely the pragmatist choice right here. The rear intermediate shaft bearing is still readily available from dealers, and for some reason I chose to use a hammer with the proper tool rather than putting it into the press. I guess just to prove that it can be done without a press? I don't know. But once that's done, you put the lock ring back on and you're home free, so long as that's all you need to do. Again, this transmission was in excellent shape, so I didn't need to mess with any of the synchros or the gears or anything like that. Please note that according to the factory service manual, the wear threshold on the dog teeth for the gears is like half of the tooth, so they can look pretty ragged and still technically be okay according to the factory. Let's put our bearing pulling monstrosity right back to good use on the rear bearing for the input shaft. Once we remove that, it's up to use the splitter in the press with the front bearing on the input shaft. Thank goodness both of these bearings are readily available from basically any parts store. I used Timken bits to put these back together, and fortunately I've got the specialty tools to set them back on the shaft. Now, while I have over the years collected the specialty tools necessary to drive the races out of the case for the input shaft and out of the I guess, bearing support plate for the back side of the input shaft, I think that careful and prudent use of some sockets and or homemade tools, especially if you have your own lathe, could easily get this done. You're still going to need either the press or a big hammer and some patience and a good angular judgment with whatever you're using to drive it with, but it's not the end of the world if you don't have this as far as all the specialty tools. And worst case scenario, maybe if you're in good with a local shop, they might cut you a deal. Although somebody did tell me recently they wanted like a couple $100 to put a couple bearings on a differential or something. Oh boy, some guys just don't have any sense. I mean, how is that a way to get business in the future? Oh, there I go again talking. All right, no more rambling on. With everything all set to go, it's time to put the bearing support plate on the back of the, I guess, larger bearing support plate, and that'll allow you to space the rear bearing cup for the input shaft when you use the press. It's important that you have that bolted on there, and actually the manual says to torque it down, but whatever works. 2 blocks of wood will help space everything off, and again, please be careful. These are Chrysler Corporation castings from the 1990s, so I would definitely take extra care to ensure you don't crack and or break it. Once again, Adam Lingle has made some of these, and they are beautiful, but also about as rare as a unicorn. So let's just keep the stock casting in one piece, huh?
All right, I just got a little carried away there, and I put the back bearing support plate with all 4 bolts in it, set the input shaft down in there, and put the back cover on. Only thing in the case is the input shaft.
Okay, it's time to set the preload on our input shaft bearings. This is a little bit difficult to show here, but I can assure you I stuck a, quote, gauging shim behind the snout, what I think the factory service manual refers to as the cup, and I torqued those 3 bolts down to spec. From there, it's time to get our dial indicator set up, which is again a pretty interesting deal.
Okay, here's my setup for gauging the in-play. I ran a bolt in one of the starter holes here that's holding that puller you saw earlier out of that Harbor Freight kit that apparently does it all. I've got a mag base holder here, kind of twisted around in an odd way, but nonetheless with some preload, if you want to call it, some I don't know, a few tenths here into this 1-inch dial indicator. I have run it through, if you will, and what you can do is come back here, and I can see right here that I'm about 71 to 72 thousandths. Now, interestingly enough, this thing does have some run out in it, so, but I almost wonder if that's not just, me not being able to do what have you. Anyway, it's about 72 thousandths. I go all the way in the other way, and they do say, by the way, to spin this thing around a few times to get it all seated right, but go the other way, and I'm looking about 48 thousandths, 47 or 48. There does seem to be a little bit of run out on this thing. So yeah, about 47 thousandths. So that's 23 thousandths in addition to that 20 thousandths shim right there. So what I really need is about 45 thousandths. Now I do have a combination of shims that I can use for this, so I will probably try and creep up on it a little bit, because with that 20 thousandths shim, and I do have a, let me actually measure here off camera, I do have one shim, it's going to be good, it's about 12 thousandths. So if I take my fattest shim, which is 36, that's going to get me dangerously close. I also have a 32, 32,000. So, 32 and the 12
that gets me 44, which is going to be about what I need. 44, 45. So, and you should subtract 2 thousandths actually, by the way, for getting the proper preload. So if we're talking, I got the 20 thousandths in there and about 22, 23, take off the 2, you're looking at 41. So, you know, yeah, it's going to be dicey with this, but we'll see here in a minute. 21 millimeter 12-point socket will kind of press on here and hold firm enough to where I can see that my turning torque on here with my CDI torque wrench that I've literally used a couple times to literally do this exact same thing hits about 4, maybe 5 inch-pounds, and this is with some preload. I've actually got a little bit of preload in here, so but yeah, the turning torque not that high. There's a couple spots in here where it'll get a little bit higher, maybe, but not much. I mean, but anyway, we do have a little bit of preload on this. I read where one guy that I respect very highly in regard to these transmissions post from years ago where he said he goes for 6 to 8 thousandths of preload on the shims. I think I've got 4 on this. So 3, 4, I figure, you know, not really a, I don't know. We'll see. That's what he does. Factory says no preload, so you know, somewhere in between there is what I'm kind of hoping for, I guess. And I'm going to put a seal on this thing and call it a day on the input shaft. Now to install the seal here, and I'm just going to use any old seal driver guy that I got lying around. And they call for wooden hammer, but I'm going to use this real dead low hammer with a light touch here. We successfully driven that down in there, and indeed we have. So a nice flush seal there, and ready to go back on with a bead of RTV around here, and then we'll torque those bolts, I believe, to 21 foot-pounds. No problems. Maybe.
Alright, now it's time to drop the input shaft with the new bearings on it and the intermediate shaft with the new bearing on the rear of it back into the case. I'm not going to lie, this was very difficult to show on camera and quite a pain, so we're just going to go ahead and say that I did that and move on to the next scene here.
Alright, this little doodad here gets just placed into one of the little gates, if you will, for the selector lever, and it just sits in there. They say to use, quote, petroleum, so some bearing grease or something, to keep it in place. I'm going to let gravity kind of do its job as I knock this in, and I don't think I'm going to be able to show me knocking all these roll pins in, but the roll pins that I've taken pretty well all of them out now. Seems like that's the way to go. I'm going to see if I can use gravity to hold this guy in. Just turn the case on its side and slide everything in and use the roll pin. If I can get a little bit of it on camera, I'll try, but I don't know. So I was going to try and use the back cover to drive all these things on, but that just wasn't working, especially for this piece that requires that little nib to be in there, because it apparently fits right in this slot, and these things get locked together. So I'm going to try and install this now, and in order to do that, you got to kind of weasel this guy down and then get it into place, which is going to be right there, and then there we go. And now these are in the right spot. So this is, I believe, how this works here. So it's going to be something like that. There we go. So we'll have to drift all these things back in there, which won't be too terrible, but it's not going to be the greatest thing in the world either. So we got to make sure we got each of these shift rod pieces aligned correctly so that we can drift them all together. And some of them are pretty obvious here, others I don't think are. So I don't know. I'm going to refer to my picture in the factory service manual because that's going to be critical at this point. And just leaving it like this with the situation at hand in regard to, if you want to call it, driving the roll pins, etc. I think doing it this way is going to be the best way to go. You just leave it open like this. Again, weaseling that little pin that sits in here and then interlocks in there with that reverse shift rail, kind of the way to go. I am going to attempt to knock this roll pin in there. I'm sure I'll be using a magnet more than once doing this, but there's just frankly no way I can do this on camera. So take my word for it. I'm going to insert the roll pin into this right here, and again you can kind of see how this will interact here. That's going to be your reverse selector lever, and of course this is locked in, right? So it's going to move this lever, which throws this guy here. So there's my reverse, there's the reverse selector that's going to do that, and again it's going to go like that and move the lever down there. So there it is. I'm going to drive this roll pin now.
Okay, once again, trying to show everything in the selector housing area while I'm putting it back in just didn't really work very well. You got some great shots of my elbow, but that's about it. I reinstalled that sort of little C-clip onto, I believe it was the 5th gear selector rail. From there, I knocked in all of the roll pins, and that pretty well takes us to the time where we need to get everything lined up and those roller detents and springs installed so that we can stick the cover back on. Good times.
Okay, this is roughly the alignment you want to have the selectors in. That's neutral right there, not in reverse at all, obviously. And so the selector cover should go down on there with the pin in it locked in neutral. And that should be your best bet with these springs and roller guys to get them where they need to be, when they need to be, in order to be good. Now on the front side here, I will go ahead and place anaerobic sealer all around the outside edge and place that cover on. And then it's time for the shuttle interlock and everything, which should be a huge, huge amount of fun. Alright, after a liberal application, as you can see, of anaerobic sealer, I was able to get quite nicely this shuttle interlock guy to really line up there. I was kind of surprised. You just kind of fiddle with the mechanism in there and they will eventually drop into place. It wasn't very frustrating at all, to be honest, and I was surprised by that. I do need, however, to get the snap ring on this bearing here, and then I'll be able to put on the back plate and should be good to go there. So that might take a minute, but it shouldn't be too bad either. I'm just going to pull up on this shaft while tapping with a dead blow hammer. That'll expose the ridge, put the snap ring on, then I'll be ready to put that, like I said, the bearing retainer plate back here, put that on, which will cover these guys up and hopefully take the problems out of that. Put 5th gear on, be ready to bolt the cover on. And alright, other than installing some new bearings here, this transmission was quite pretty on the inside. That I really just had to lift up on the shaft a little bit and it exposed the ridge for that retainer. So put that snap ring on, good to go. These are going to be 21 foot-pounds each. I am going to use some blue Loctite because the factory was such a big fan of it. And then we'll get this thing on, probably put the top cover on, do 5th gear. We're going to have this thing all set, but the diff, and I'm just waiting on the bearings for that to come in. So I'm going to go get some Loctite and call it a day here. Tight for these guys, and we should be all set. Like I say, I'm not being shy about it. Overall, this thing hasn't been too terrible. Like I say, I can, and perhaps because I've done them so many more times, I can knock the 525, 555s out, no problem. Not that this has been anything crazy, but again, when I've collected the vast majority of the tools and have this skill set from doing the other ones, you know,
It's just not that big of a deal. Alright, we're going to go ahead and get these things started with the socket here. 21 foot-pounds on these bad lads, so nothing crazy, right? Oh, lordy, lordy, lordy. Well, folks, we've got just a huge problem here. Huge, huge, huge problem. Don't forget step number one. That's to put this guy back, your little bearing retainer. So guess what, everybody? It all comes back apart. Every bit of it comes back apart. Okay, well, at least we know how to do it. Alright, well, for the third time, I'll try this here. I don't know what I've been doing. I guess I haven't been hitting the record button hard enough, but bottom line is, had to redo quite a bit there. And basically pull the whole thing apart again. So I did just jam the 5th gear nut on with the electric impact. Got the synchronizer and all that on. I mean, just the reverse of removal, right? Same deal, nothing too fancy. And again, liberal application of Loctite as we get this thing going. Also, as you can tell, liberal application of anaerobic. And we'll run this thing down here. And then hopefully get the selector cover on tonight too. With the trans and neutral, and you can check it by grabbing the input shaft and making sure that nothing's spinning here. And you might have to hold the intermediate shaft because there's enough friction to make them spin together. So trans is in neutral. We are going to drop down the rollers, and you want to make sure that you let these guys drop down with the wheel in line with where the grooves are going to be, if you will, so they can actually roll up and down on it. You put them in there sideways, that's probably not going to be the best. So, there we go. They do have little notches, so if you need to, you can turn them with a screwdriver.
Alright, well, I have gotten a lot better over the years at installing these selector covers. It used to be a real pain. Now I take great care that all of the selector bits in there are lined up as well as possible, and when possible, I like to use the neutral lock on the top side of the selector cover to ensure that it's pretty well in neutral. Now you do have to look out because a lot of these are stripped and in rough shape these days, so be careful with that little bit. This trans had a pretty rough shape one, and I don't think there's much threads left after I had to remove it and reinstall it, but nonetheless that did work, and I started by kind of leaning it on there and then setting it down straight and then mushing it all down with the bolts properly torqued, and then you can check to see that it works correctly, and in my case it did on the first try. I got lucky. Sometimes you find you have to pull it back off, so don't force it, and also make sure that you have those bolts in the right spot. If you put bolts that are too long in the wrong spot, it is very easy to crack the case. I made that mistake once and won't make it again. Alright, next it was time to measure the in-play on the differential spider gears and everything. I'm not gonna lie, I had a little bit of a rough time with this one. Every single differential I pulled out of the basement, and I think I checked at least 4 or 5 of them, had as much, if not more, in play than this trans that came out of this shadow. Now, that said, I think the factory service manual calls for, I think, a max of 13 thousandths. I think I still might have been right around that max, maybe a thousandth over. However, I feel fully confident that I'm not going to have any problems with this differential, given the fact that so many of them had 2 or 3 times the amount of in-play that this diff had. If those all stay together, frankly, some of them threw at least, well, more than stock horsepower, let's put it that way. I've got no doubt that this diff will serve in my family minivan for years to come.
Alright, so found this diff in my basement. It's got the diff pin retainers, which is nice. So those off so that I can install them on this other diff.
Alright guys, I'm not gonna lie, I went all the way through rebuilding this differential and showed pretty well every step. I think that's 20 some odd minutes you guys probably don't want to see. If I'm wrong, let me know down in the comments if you're still watching the video in the first place, let alone want to see how to rebuild one of these differentials, and I'll make sure to get that in. Otherwise, we're gonna zip past this bit and get on to the rest.
I have got to shim the diff, which means that the ring gear's got to come off. So we'll just work on that next from start to finish here. Here we go. 13 millimeter on this. Alright, and then just a light tap. Alright, we're going to set up the bearing splitter just like you've seen me do earlier in this video on some of the shims and things, or not the shims, but on the other bearings. We're going to just put the bearing puller on here, pull it right off, and then I'll probably show you pressing them on. So that won't be too exciting, so probably won't videotape it. Alright, now we are going to take our bearing, which has been somewhat pre-lubed for our convenience, and then place our 4410 tool over it, and then pump way too many times on this handle in order to get this thing to go. Alright, and there's our bearing installed with the 4410 tool.
Okay, so with the diffs ready to be shimmed, we can take apart this puller to kind of show you how it works. There's a bearing and a washer, also a nut there. Inside of that, there is another piece. The threaded rod in there actually drives the 2 feet, if you will, apart from one another, and you control that with this nut here. Loosen the nut up, and then the feet can go together. Those feet will then tuck up under the race. You can then tighten the nut back up to get the feet behind the race, and then you can set the outside body of the puller back on, and it will then pull the race out under this section of I guess the bearing support, if you want to call it that, this bearing cup. That's where the shims are located. So we're going to be in a process where we need to install and reinstall and uninstall, I guess, or remove that bearing cup several times as we go through this process of shimming the diff. It can be kind of a pain, but honestly, if you follow what the factory service manual says and then get a little bit of a tip from a few guys here and there, it's really not too bad.
There we go. And our race is out. There we go. Got quite a few different diffs in the basement, so we have to. There you can see there is our shim. So if we have to, we can get some more shims from the basement. But I'll get this guy cleaned up, get our new race pressed in. I'll show you that, I guess. Alright, this operation is going to be pretty straightforward here. I've got my new race set in there, and then I've got Miller Tool 4520, which you will, of all of them, you don't need most of the tools, to be honest with you. And I'm sure that I could have a bearing driver set from the local Harbor Freight, which would do just fine. However, I really do enjoy this particular tool. You use it a lot. I use it for the diff bearings. You just use it for a few of the bearings, so you know, whatever works, I guess. So we'll use this to seat this bearing against the shim. There we go. The snout attached just a little bit, pushed all the way up against the table. The Then give it just a real light snugging, so now it's in there. And then now what we can do is take our top piece here, this is the part with the shim in it, and we can install this. And again, just going to real lightly snug it down. Doesn't have to be anything spectacular at all, because all we're doing is checking the in-play in this. Now note there's no ring gear here, right? We don't have a ring gear on it, and we're going to check our play, which right now feels like it's about none. So since we have no play in this, I will throw a little more oil on these than what I had. Okay, so liberally oiled. Okay. We are going to check and see the turning torque on this. So actually feels pretty snug. It feels like I got too much shim in there. And this is just the same shim that came in it. So we'll see what the turning torque is on it. I'll show you how we do that next.
All right, with the diff back in this trans, we need to go ahead and check the turning torque. I was only about 4 or 5 inch-pounds on this one, and that's just not enough. We needed quite a bit more than this. I want to say it's like 14 to 17. I'll probably end up correcting myself, though. And that leaves you in a position where you need to pull that shim back out and add more shim. Good times. Okay, with 78 thousandths of shim later, we're in a situation where we have about 14 inch-pounds of turning torque, which is just fine. I have read some guys going higher, maybe around 17 inch-pounds or so, and I'll defer to them on this, but again, I'm just looking for something that's going to be factory. I don't need anything to handle hundreds and hundreds of horsepower. About 200 horsepower max is going to be where we are with this. Alright, as we look at the bottom side of the differential on the case, you can see it looks like the factory has set up a boss specifically for a drain plug. It's Chrysler, so I'm guessing they just thrifted out the drain plug in the process of the design, but nonetheless, here we are 30 some odd years later, ready to put one in. We're going to put in a nice 3/8 inch NPT pipe plug with a broached Allen socket deal on there, if you will, and that'll go really well when it comes time to drain the trans oil at regular intervals now that we can actually do so.
Hand drill, of course, so this is probably going to be more than enough.
Alright, well, interestingly enough, the tap wrench that I made myself in a machining class, of course, was at school, so I wasn't able to use it here. Nonetheless, the spline drive SK ratcheting wrenches came in clutch on this 3/8 MPT tap. Just be careful when you guys do this. If you're like me, you've gone a little too deep with the tap. There is obviously a little bit of give and take as far as how deep things want to thread in. Sometimes it seems like I'll get a pipe plug that's really kind of fat for 3/8 MPT, and sometimes it'll be kind of small, and I guess that goes for any size. But nonetheless, be careful and check as you go a couple times so you don't end up with a hole that's too big for your plug. Now it's time to make sure you've thoroughly cleaned those ring gear to differential bolts and get those installed with some Loctite. Here I'm using, yes, some red Loctite, but it's not the stuff that you use a torch to remove it. This is just the extra high strength or whatever. I don't really see much of a difference between that and the blue in practice. Anyway, nonetheless, get those on. Don't forget to put the little diff saver wing strut guys on there, if you will. To keep that pin in place, and you don't have to use the roll pin then, added bonus. So do that and you are ready to put this bad lad in the case. And by put it in the case, of course, I mean torque those ring gear bolts. I use a pry bar on the opposite side, and I pry, if you will, I mean, you just resist the force with the pry bar on one of the flats of an opposing bolt, and then use, of course, the body of the diff, and that'll hold your differential in place while you give it the appropriate torque.
Okay, I hate to do this to you guys, but here we are nonetheless. We've got the trans back together. It's unfortunate that I couldn't take you along on this, but quite frankly, I forgot the camera on the day that put it together. So here we are. You want to use an anaerobic sealer around the outside machine portions here. Make sure you get your bolts in the right spot. It should be pretty evident. Up here where the case is thinnest, obviously, that's going to be your two shortest bolts. And then there's 4 of them that are the real long jobs for the case is highest. It's pretty evident which ones go where. And don't forget the 2 out here house the bracket, which could have been cleaned a little bit better, I'll give you that. So that's the anaerobic side of things. Back here on this side, you're going to put actual RTV around all the bolt holes like they show in the manual. I'll see if I can get that up for you guys. And then also around the edge of the round inner piece here near the base of it. You can see a little bit of the RTV smooshed out here, and that's what you want. Okay, it's the same story on the front side for the snout that holds the speed distance sensor here. You want RTV going all the way around the base. This is the side I believe that has the O-ring in it. RTV around the O-ring. And of course you're going to put that differential in there, and you have to kind of get that in there, put this on, put the other side on, and then tighten them up. So that is a little bit of a process. And then finally, the thing that I didn't show, and this is pretty easy, frankly, don't forget your shims. Stick your shims in there, RTV once again around the bolt holes, etc. There it is. It should be kind of smooshed out, and there you go. Last thing to do on this trans, and I will be frank, I'm pretty well done with it, is to put the fork and the arm back in, put your E-clip on, throw out bearing. Pretty straightforward though, really, at the end of the day. And you got your trans back together and ready to go in. I'm pretty thrilled with this, and look forward to shifting the gears, especially with the higher gas prices these days, with a little bit numerically lower final drive. Get those RPMs down in 5th anyway. So alright, I hope you guys enjoyed this and you got something out of it. It's really not bad to do these. And I might revisit the 520, 555 trans build video that I did years ago and do a really nice one with that, because quite frankly that's way easier than this. So if you thought this is something that you could potentially do, the 555s are nothing compared to this, in my opinion at least. So much easier. So I'm going to let you guys go now, but thanks a ton for following along. I really appreciate it. I'm going to try and get some more videos up and going here.